And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about who I am and how it led into the work that I do. I also grew up in Southern California at the beach. I grew up in San Diego. I was born in Malibu. And my favorite activities were all based with the water. So I grew up fishing and kayaking and sailing, and being in the water or sailing or fishing on the water was always my favorite activity growing up. We also spent a lot of time camping, and every vacation we would go down to Baja California and go fishing and camping and sailing, kayaking. And so that was one of my favorite activities to do with my family. And one of the things that I loved to do on those camping trips was just walk up and down the beaches and look at all the things that had washed up. And my favorite thing was, poking and prodding all of the dead animals on the beach and just kind of dissecting them and looking at their interior structures. And so I would look really closely at things like stingrays and jellyfish and pufferfish and just sort of observe and see what's inside. So we were kind of talking about the theme of beauty and terror, also my own, something that's really beautiful that pulls you in, but it's also a little scary. It can hurt you. And so I spent a lot of time looking at these animals and looking at their structure. And the most interesting part of their structure was what was exposed by their death. And so I would look at their skeletons, look at all the spikes and the thorns and other kinds of things that they would use for protection in a hostile environment. So if you look at fish, a lot of fish have these thorns that are very, very sharp that can pierce you. They have barbs on their tails that can hurt you. And that was always really fascinating for me. So my early work, when I was doing my MFA, I was doing paintings of insects trapped in amber. And I was using a technique called encaustic, which is using wax. So for me, that was really fascinating to create paintings that were about insects made with a material made by insects. And during that time period, I went to a show at UC Berkeley Science Museum based on the electron scanning microscope. And when I saw those images, they were so fascinating because you could see every tiny little piece of the insect and the little hairs on their legs and their eyes and all of the patterns and repetition that were part of the structure of the animal. And so that really inspired me to start looking at microscopic images. So I got really interested in how art and science are similar in a lot of ways. We often think of scientists and artists as being polar opposites, but there's actually a lot of the same use of the brain that we use in terms of creative problem solving. And so if you think about artistic experimentation and scientific investigation, it's all about lateral thinking, thinking outside the box, looking at a problem from every angle, and trying to come up with a unique and creative solution. And so that's what we do as artists, but it's also how scientists invent things and explore. So I really love that idea of experimentation and play and just working with the materiality and trying out new ideas. And so I think there's a lot of parallels between artistic experimentation and scientific exploration. And one of the reasons why I started working abstractly is because I like people to be able to come in and look at the work and come up with their own unique interpretation. There's really a lot of room that's open for someone's own experience to play into how they engage with the artwork. And so a lot of the work that I do is very open-ended in terms of how people approach it, how people interpret it. And so I like that abstraction and that ability to leave room for people's imagination. And so a lot of the abstract work that I've been doing over the past several years has dealt with that parallel between art and science. One of the installations I did about 20 years ago was an installation about viruses. And I was welding nails together into these spiky little balls that you threw at the wall to install it. And so people could come into the gallery, take it off the wall, and throw it. So it was constantly changing as people came into the gallery and interacted with the piece. The form of that piece looks just like COVID. And so it's really interesting to see, like, you know, several years later after making that piece, how the virus affected all of our lives. And so I really am interested in that idea of looking at things under a microscope, because COVID is so harmful, but when you look at it under a microscope, it's really beautiful. And I was doing a whole series of drawings about diseases and viruses. Like, for example, if you look at anthrax under the microscope, it's a really beautiful form. And so that is something that I'm really interested in, that attraction, repulsion, beauty, and terror all runs through that. So this installation that I did for the zip ties came out of that piece that I did from the virus, where I was making lots of spiky things. And I did all these sculptures made with nails. And they're actually quite painful to do. They're painful to make, and because they're sharp. And so I was doing a lot of welding, and I realized I just couldn't sustain that because it was harmful to myself to keep making these really sharp materials and sculptures. So that's how I kind of discovered the zip ties. I started moving into softer materials that still had that spiky quality, that look of danger, but also beauty that pulls you in. And so I started using the zip ties and also creating the armatures made with steel. And so these installations are really based on a lot of those experiences that I had looking at diatoms, images under the microscope, pollen, which is beautiful under the microscope, but it also affects people who have allergies, things like plankton, and algae that you see floating on top of the ocean. I like to go kayaking and fishing, and I've done that all over the world. And one of my favorite things to do is just look at things floating either on the surface of the water or underneath the water, and just fascinated by the natural geometry of forms. And so I'm really interested by an artist whose name is Ernst Haeckel. He's done a lot of drawings of diatoms. And those are something that really inspire me because they're really beautiful drawings, but they also translate really well into three-dimensional forms. So when I'm making these pieces, I often try to use anthropomorphic ideas where taking these inanimate man-made materials and make them look alive, or make them look like they're about to move. And so this is really an important part of the installation, and using these kinds of materials, but making them look like little creatures that you might see under the microscope or in the ocean. And so I try and make them look as alive as possible, make them look like they're moving. And when I'm making them, I really try and play with the materials. And so there's a whole level of creating the sculpture that brings me a lot of joy, even though some of them look quite scary. They're also look funny and weird. And I like that about them. There's many different levels and layers about making them. So I try and really anthropomorphize and animate them so that they look like they're alive and beautiful. There's but also a darker layer that I draw on from working with the materials, where a lot of artists have a deeper and darker side, and I definitely have a dark side. So one of the choices that I'm making as an artist with this particular series is using plastic and how it affects the environment. And so it's something that I observed in all of the beaches that I've been in, all over the world. There's plastic on the beaches, and it's such a destructive material. So especially to ocean creatures who have absorbed it into their systems. So there's that level of that darkness to the work in using the plastic that's very intentional to try and discuss that way that we affect the environment, the way that we as humans have changed the ocean and the creatures that live in it with the use of plastic. And so that's, I thought a lot about these themes during COVID, because this whole project, Symbiosis, started right when we were in lockdown during COVID. I live alone, and I was in my studio basically for a year teaching through the computer, and that was my main interaction with people, was through the computer with my students. And so one of the techniques that I'm using in these pieces is the armature created with looping that's inspired by Ruth Asawa, who is a really amazing artist. She just had a retrospective at SF MoMA, and she creates these wire sculptures using this looping technique, and I just love her work. But during COVID, when we were, isolated, I often thought about her because she is a Japanese-American artist who during World War II, her whole family was interred in the Japanese camps. So she was a California girl, and her whole family was moved out to the desert and interred for almost 2 years in a Japanese internment camp. So every time I started to feel sorry for myself during COVID, I thought about Ruth and her extraordinary work. And so I couldn't feel sorry for myself because that was her experience, and she became such an amazing artist. So I feel like these pieces that are using her technique are kind of an homage to Ruth and her really extraordinary work. And so a lot of the pieces are using a combination of zip ties and Ruth's technique. The looping is made with steel and aluminum and copper wire. And so you can see her technique just sort of running through the show, like, for example, that piece right there. It looks like something you'd see under a microscope, but it's also kind of an homage to Ruth. I really admire her work. So when I'm installing the show, I try and be very organic and just play to the space and arrange things according to space. So this changes for each gallery it's in. And so I was really so happy to have this space to install it, because this is the first time I've shown the entire series. And I've been working on the series for 5 years, so it's really a joy to see it all up. I think there's so much that scientists and artists have in common in terms of how they explore, how they invent, how they create, how they use their brain to think outside the box. And so that whole creative problem solving is something that we both do. And it's a shame that they're considered such opposite fields. And I deal with that as an educator because so much of our education system is focused on STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, and math. But there's so much that we teach in the arts that leads to better thinking, more critical thinking, being able to analyze something visual, because visual art is just another form of language. And so if we only focus on math and verbal and oral languages, we're losing a whole part of the way that we communicate. And so visual language has a lot of power. It's kind of like when you listen to music and it makes you feel emotions just from, the music itself. They use that a lot in movies to build up emotion. We do that a lot with art. It has a lot of power. And so I think that's something that, I as an educator really want to, emphasize. So I think that teaching arts, it creates a holistic approach to how we use our brain and how we view the world.